I'm June Gruber, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Colorado Boulder and director of this mental health expert series. I'm delighted to be here today with Dr. Jonathan Rottenberg, a professor of psychology at the University of South Florida, about his work on depression. So thank you, John, for being here today to speak with us.
Wonderful to be with you.
I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about the kind of mental health research you do.
Sure. My research broadly is about emotional functioning in depression, and what we're consumed with is trying to get a full resolution picture of how depression, major depressive disorder, affects emotional reactivity. So responses in how people feel, how they behave in emotion-related physiology. And to a degree also how people regulate those impulses. And we're interested in how changes in emotional reactivity and regulation relate to why people become depressed, why they might remain depressed, and why people might recover from the disorder.
And how did you go about first getting started in this work on depression?
Well, I got into this at a good time. When I was in graduate school, this field called affective science was really starting to take off, and I went to graduate school in the Bay Area, that is San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a wealth, as you well know, of expertise in affective science. And I was really interested in bridging what we know from the basic study of emotion, how to measure emotions, how to elicit emotions, and measure them both in a laboratory and naturalistic context with the study of psychopathology. And I was particularly interested in applying this to depression because, as you know, it is one of the most prevalent in impairing, unfortunately, mental health conditions, and in fact, health conditions that there is.
So in doing this work, as you're saying, on one of the most common and impairing of all mental health conditions, over your career trajectory, starting in graduate school, looking at affective science and that lens through which to understand depression till now, what have been some notable frustrations or failures along the way, as well as successes you've been able to savor?
Well, myself and people in the field have really started to fill in the picture. When I began in graduate school, we weren't too far away from the grandma view of depression, which has an essential rightness, which is that when people are depressed, they feel just awful. And that is an important place to start, the patient's perspective, this phenomenology of depression, that it is this horrible consuming affective state that people feel entirely trapped in. Our task was then to try to figure out, okay, in what ways exactly beyond the obvious does depression influence ongoing emotional reactivity to both positive and negative emotional contexts, and how does it change emotional responding in different systems of response, like behavior, physiology, and how people feel. And the answers that we got were not totally what I thought, at least, I would find going in. Some of the field really was dominated by cognitive approaches to depression, and those have a certain merit. They've explained why it is that depressed people are so good at remembering negative stimuli, why their attention might be diverted to negative stimuli. So naturally, from that perspective, one would hypothesize that if you present negative emotion and generative stimuli to depressed people, that they're going to respond really vigorously. And that was kind of the default hypothesis. And without any data, I think that was my own expectation, but that's really not what we found. What we found was that in a broad sense, depression was diminishing reactivity to a variety of emotional contexts, the phenomena we call emotion context insensitivity. Then it has been a matter of figuring out in one sense is that's true, in what senses that might not characterize emotional responding, and what's the broader significance of this pattern. Is it a risk factor? Is it a maintenance factor? Is it related to course? And since I started in graduate school, now many people have entered the field, and I really enjoyed seeing what other people are finding and comparing comparing notes, because it's very different from when I first started out, where I was doing like literally the first study, for example, of crying in depression. And at the time, people were like, "Well, why would you do a study of crying in depression? Depressed people, they cry a lot, right? I mean, it's in the DSM." And that was another place where our findings really didn't match our initial intuitions, because we didn't find that depressed people were more likely to cry to a standardized cry eliciting stimulus, and their behavioral and physiological responses looked like, if anything, depression was diminishing the crying response, kind of consistent with this emotion context insensitivity. And then that led to all sorts of other puzzles, like, okay, so if depression doesn't enhance crying in the lab, why are clinicians always seeing that depressed people are displaying crying behavior in session? And so then that naturally leads you to ask, well, might this be a behavior that's enhanced by certain contexts, like if you're talking to a sympathetic other, versus just the normative generic cry eliciting stimuli don't seem to do much for depressed people. And that that's sort of an example of how by collecting data, we could learn things that not only filled out the picture in a broad sense, and then we could tell grandma something more nuanced, but it connects to our clinical experience of working with depressed people and seeing how they progress, over the course of the disorder. So now things actually, in a way, they make more sense. Understanding how, for example, crying might be enhanced in certain contexts and diminished in certain contexts, and how that relates to the experience of depressed people.
I found your research so incredibly powerful for so many years, and I often teach it to my students in my classes, both undergrad and graduate, because it shows just how powerful these laboratory tools can be to overturn the way we think about what depression is, and approach it in the real world clinically too.
Yeah, I think that's really important. In terms of, you asked about challenges, and I think that I've been talking about some of the sort of the basic descriptive work, which I think has gone really well. Some of the areas that I'm interested in now are, in a sense, they're more challenging, but that's a good thing. So I've more recently got interested in thinking about the long-term course of depression. So we know from epidemiology, one of the most important facts about depression is that it's often recurrent, but not always. And it turns out that about half, maybe a little bit more, of people who have depression will have multiple episodes. But then there's this nearly other half. And I started to really wonder, what about them? Because we have this picture of depression as being invariably destructive and often a lifelong condition. But there actually were very few studies of a real long-term course, particularly those focusing on individuals who had a good outcome. And to get to the challenges, it's very hard to study clinical populations, because it's hard to gather the samples, and then it's hard to retain them over long periods of time. In order to see good outcomes, if those are in the minority, you would need to enlist a huge sample, have tons of grant money. And I was just at the beginning of this kind of enterprise. And so for the time being, I've been using other people who collected data for a totally different purpose to try to gain purchase on this question of long-term outcome and are there good outcomes in depression. So it's been very challenging and very rewarding. So I guess you could have those simultaneously, because while it's hard to find the data and it's hard to find the data that you would have collected if you were approaching this yourself, we have found some things that I think are quite interesting, and again, maybe challenge some established ideas about what depression is and what the prognosis of depression is.
So when you think about these simultaneous, challenges and successes over the course of your career, and you sort of forecast looking ahead at the future of the field, what do you see as the most important steps that lie ahead?
In the study of depression?
Yeah.
Well, I think I've always followed my own curiosity, and I've had I've had the latitude to do that and work with great people who have helped me accomplish those goals. In terms of future, so we're at the beginning of this the second wave of research trying to understand the long-term course of depression, particularly the good outcomes. We know some basic facts that I think are important. We're trying to replicate those results so that, for example, about 10% of people who have a depressive episode, if you were to follow them for a decade and then to see how they're doing, about 10% of those people would not only not have a recurrence, but will be reporting extremely high levels of well-being. And that's a really encouraging finding, but I think it leads to other questions, such as what explains that? Why do some people have these really good outcomes that haven't been much discussed by scientists? I think clinicians know that some patients do extraordinarily well, but in terms of a systematic study, there isn't much there yet. So to understand what explains this, and obviously what we'd want to do is to bottle it. So to the extent that people are doing things in terms of their routines or how they regulate themselves, or they have some kind of other protective factors that we might build upon. And what we want to do is to understand why those people enjoy those good outcomes and see what we can learn from them. And perhaps we can apply to people who are still struggling with depression some of the lessons learned from studying people who are in that 10 or 12 or 15% of people who have extremely good long-term outcomes.
So the last question I have for you today is, what advice might you have for others, such as those who might be watching this interview today, students, scholars, the public, who are interested in getting involved in the field?
Follow your curiosity. I know it's a cliche, but it's gotten me and I think a lot of other scientists where they want to be, because curiosity means that you care and that you're engaged and you'll work hard when you hit obstacles. Curiosity also means that you're following an intuition that something isn't right, something doesn't make sense. So for example, about the crying, I saw that the diagnostic manual, the DSM system, mentions crying as a sign of depression. And I was like, really? Yeah, it makes sense, but like, where is the data? And a lot of people do research where they have a strong expectation, a strong theory about how the data will come out. But I think if you find an area that people haven't investigated before and you're driven by raw curiosity and you're filling a vacuum, nearly anything that you would find would be noteworthy. I mean, I think if I had confirmed that in fact depressed people cry a lot more in the lab with standardized stimuli, then we could be like, okay, the DSM is right. Now we have data to support, this clinical lore. And so that's the value of a good question. That no matter what you find, it'll be interesting and hopefully lead to other things.
Thank you for such a thoughtful answer, and really just thank you so much for speaking today. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, June.